get going with the conversation, and basically we have John with us, and John, you are going to speak to us about the court of Lixnaw and the people that live there and the people that built there. More importantly, maybe. You had a good question there, didn't you? Before you were about to ask.
Me, is it?
Yeah.
I was just curious, like, you know, you're creating this play around the characters, I think, isn't it, in the landscape?
That's right.
And things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So I'm just curious to know, from your perspective, what's your perception of the family and the courts and its significance?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I tell you, it's actually we're not hugely aware of the significance of the family per se, you know, and that's something that we'd like to know. But it is curious on a very simple level that that there was this like very ornate court building, court grounds with parkland and canals set in Lixnaw, because I'm from the area, and until I found this out, Lixnaw was really like a kind of a I would say a kind of a farming town, not a very touristic place, not a kind of glamorous place, and I parse my words. And so I was very surprised to learn that it was actually the capital of Kerry, and that it was the center of kind of a lot of you know, advances in architecture and design and thinking and yeah, like what exactly that is, I'm not too sure, you know, and also there's something counterintuitive about the Fitzmaurices, in that they are at once a kind of ancestral family, but also they were like a family that brought okay, I don't know if this is a good phrase to use, but English culture, let's say capitalist culture, let's say Western culture to the area. And
it's an interesting, I think, debate. I suppose there's a new book published in Kerry quite recently, and it's quite interesting, that whole question of colonial culture and how it was brought into Kerry and when did it start.
Yeah,
you know, it's a very interesting debate. I mean, you could push it back to the 11th and 12th centuries, probably, when the Fitzmaurices came first.
Yeah.
And like, what is quite interesting is people often think there was this big chasm in, say, 1660 or the Cromwellian periods, but in actual fact, a lot of the things that were like private ownership, leasing, all that sort of thing were already in place in Kerry. I mean, it's quite interesting if you look up the 1641 rebellion, the accounts of that in Kerry, and Protestants in Kerry who lost property. It's quite clear that there was a very strong capitalist culture already in place that seems to have coexisted with an older Gaelic culture. So I think, you know, there was never a kind of a blank canvas. Like there was always kind of an accumulation of things over centuries, and then there was occasional spurts of activity, I suppose, you know, that you'd see in advance in a generation that might have taken 100 years before that. So I think you kind of need to see Lixnaw as part of a kind of continual development of North Kerry over a period of 600-700 years.
Yeah. Okay.
And what I always was fascinated by, you know, the famous 18th century writer Charles Smith, who wrote that book on Kerry, on his visit to Kerry in 1750s, and he described Lixnaw in it, and that's where I first saw this description of Lixnaw, this description of this house with canals. And then I used to look up maps and see pretty much nothing. And it wasn't until about maybe 20 years ago when I went out to Lixnaw, not expecting to find anything. And then suddenly I came across the ruins of the old court, and shall I dare I say trespassed, and had a walk around. And then when I was looking at the landscape around it, it literally took my breath away, because it was clearly, I saw what Smith was talking about, this massive landscape, Baroque, early 18th century domain landscape that has been pretty much forgotten.
Yeah.
And is extremely important, and is probably one of only 3 or 4 that survives in the country.
Mm.
So I think how you interpret Lixnaw, what your feelings are about it, all these various kind of question marks over the Anglo-Irish or whatever you wish to call them, regardless of all that, it is still a very important landscape. And I think, I wrote the article, kind of tried to bring attention to it. And I think it certainly has worked. There seems to be a lot more people interested in the landscape now. And I think, interestingly enough, I think if it's properly presented, it offers modern Lixnaw an opportunity to kind of represent itself to the world.
Yeah.
So, which is quite an interesting take, because of course that's what the Earls were trying to do in the 18th century. So, it's really, really a fascinating landscape. And I only read recently, I think in one of the Kerry newspapers, about this ambition to rebuild the famous monument, which was blown up in the 1950s, and which led to quite a lot of local anger, because there was an attachment to this monument. It wasn't seen as some symbol of oppression, but very much, well, it was by some, but by others it was seen very much as part of the local landscape. And I think there's still a lingering anger over how that was done. So it was quite interesting to see how history is kind of reinventing itself, So, the saga of Lixnaw continues, I suppose, is what's quite interesting.
On that point of oppression, that some people do think see it as a symbol of oppression, John, what's your sense of the time? What is there much of a sense of oppression at the time when the family is moving in and making it the court?
Again, you see, I think we're such a step removed from it, and so much of our interpretation of the Anglo-Irish has been coloured by the land war of the 1880s, which was probably one of the most successful, dare I say, propaganda campaigns of modern times, which basically cast all of them, regardless whether they were good, bad, or indifferent, whether they were Protestant or Catholic or Quaker, all in the same boat. And our entire interpretation of them, allied to what happened during the famine, has coloured our view of that class, I suppose, over the centuries. Were they oppressive? Of course they were, in certain regards. I mean, they didn't manage and control this amount of land without being oppressive. I mean, that's the nature of an elite anywhere in the world. You don't have to go beyond Lixnaw. I mean, you can look at England, you can look right to the borders of Siberia. All these great estates, great houses, great palaces, great cathedrals, great art collections were all built on the wealth and on the back of others. So, like, at what stage do you say it's oppression, or whether it's it's you can go down that route, but then I think you're losing out so much else that happened in part of the thing. I suppose what's interesting about Ireland is, because there was this colonial elite, effectively, albeit now with in Kerry particularly with Gaelic attributes, can you penetrate between the top layer? It's very difficult to do it for the early 18th century, because they the land was essentially let to middleman tenants who are often prominent, say, Protestant freeholders, and then they in turn let to the kind of the farming elite. So the Earl himself and his family would have had very little day-to-day contact with the people actually tilling the soil. It's quite interesting if you look at the Fitzmaurice papers, not Fitzmaurice, the Crosby papers. It's quite clear that there was such a kind of a hierarchy of people under the head of the household that he rarely, if ever, encountered actual people tilling the soil. So, at what stage were they oppressive, or where did oppression come in? I mean, I've studied another estate in great detail, the Godfrey estate in Milltown, and which was effectively a Cromwellian estate. And it's quite clear that what they did, there wasn't this massive disruption. So the people that were there before the Cromwellian settlement continued holding the land after the Cromwellian settlement. And in fact, you can actually trace some of the families that still hold the land today, the farms, right back to the early 18th century, which is an extraordinary expanse of time. So
these
and
would
like
be your smaller, like the people who had a parcel of 30, 40,
yeah,
100 acres.
yeah, they would be what we call the kind of the big farmers, you
Yeah.
know. And what people tend to forget that the landlords and the big farmers had the same vested interests, and often worked kind of, I won't say exactly in harmony with each other, but you know, they kind of worked together, I suppose, in some regards. And it was always the small farmer and the cottier and the labourer who was the one who was really disadvantaged and who was really, I suppose, suffered from oppression from both, you know, his Irish, I suppose, superiors, but also then, of course, the whole colonial apparatus as well. So it's a very difficult thing to measure oppression. And every state is very different in how it is managed. And what you find is that every generation brought in a new way of interpreting things. So one Earl could have managed the estate with an iron fist, and his successor could have taken a completely laissez-faire attitude, delegated responsibility to the agent, and spent his time living the high life in London or Paris, which of course is what happened in respect of the third Earl of Kerry. But so yeah, it's very hard to generalize, I find. The more you kind of delve into these families and how they managed the estates, what they did, what different generations did, what their attitudes were, you know, there's no simple kind of, I suppose, catch-all interpretation of them.
Okay. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at with the question. I'm very interested. We know a lot about the life of the court and the life of the rich guys and the rich people and the rich families and everything. But I'm wondering, with the laborers and the cottiers and things like, as you were talking about, did they even notice? Did much change for them? Were they even aware of what we would consider oppression, or were they just happy with their lot? They were just doing their work, and the guy happened to change who they were paying their money to or renting the land from.
Yeah, I mean, again, you see, there's a whole kind of, I suppose, underclass there that we get glimpses of over time, but it's very hard to find exact. I mean, our history, I suppose, effectively is coloured by the fact that the major archives that survive are the colonial government, or the Dublin government here in Dublin, are the great papers of the great houses and great estates. You won't have a collection from a local cottier or farmer who couldn't probably read or write. So our history is skewed anyway in the first instance, right? So, I mean, I was able to write that article on Lixnaw because I had access to the Crosby papers, because I went over to Bowood House in Wiltshire, and I was able to look at some of the archives there. But you can be certain there's few, in fact, I think there's hardly any letters in the Crosby collection, which is quite extensive, that come from the ordinary cottier who work there. What I can say is, you know, it all depends on how an estate was managed, because you have this, basically all estates in Ireland were up to roughly the famine, well, up to the late 18th century, were managed by middlemen, which is very rare that you've got a landlord who managed an estate by directly letting two tenants. It was just too cumbersome, too awkward, too much hassle. So he basically would let his entire estate to middlemen, who in turn let it to big farmers, who in turn let plots to the underclass. So that's basically how rural society worked. And then within that whole level, there was the idea that there was one farmer, you know, managing his farm and his few cows, and sitting next to another farmer. Is not exactly how rural society worked. I mean, for example, you'd have herders who'd manage a whole herd of cattle belonging to various farmers, and they'd bring them up the mountains to graze them during the summer and bring them down to the valleys during the winter. All this sort of thing went on. There was very much a kind of a communal nature, I suppose, of living at the lower levels, from what glimpses I have seen. I'm not particularly familiar with what happened maybe in North Kerry, but I'm speaking from Mid Kerry, but I presume it wouldn't be much different. If you go up to the next level,
tell us more about that. Like, would that involve like just sharing food?
Yes,
eating together, sharing homes.
Exactly. I mean, like, let's face it, that continued right up to the 1950s and 60s in rural Ireland. This, you know, sharing the combine harvester, sharing the horse, sharing the food, all this. So that tradition of sharing goes way back, way back. And you get glimpses of it in leases. And what always used to fascinate me was you'd find a lease written in English. And then suddenly you're reading down through it, and you'll see, that Martin O'Dowlig and Connor something or other has a right to graze so many cattle in such and such a field for so many months of the year. And straight away you're getting a glimpse into that kind of communal, I suppose, setup of local farmers coming together, bringing herds together on, I suppose, kind of commonage. And, there's kind of a whole culture there that we don't really know much about. I mean, a lot of people know about the whole Gaelic parts of Kerry and the survival of Irish, but it often fascinates me that there's a whole swathe of our history that we know very little about, except in very general terms, and except where there is actual archival records. And, you get, as I say, glimpses now and again in documents, but it's very hard to be precise exactly how things work. Like what is quite interesting to me, and again, I'm only kind of, my focus in Lixnaw is very much the Earl, the family, and creation of the domain in Lixnaw. And I suppose where I've done more work is in terms of the Godfrey estate near Milltown, where I mean, it's quite clear that right up until nearly the early 19th century, a very, very, I suppose, feudal sort of culture survived underneath the layer of the middleman. And if you only really see the landlord directly intervening in the landscape and in the lives of people, really from the 1780s onward. Now, I can only speak for one estate.
Yeah.
Others historians could come on and say, well, actually, this happened in such and such an estate much earlier or much later. But I think there is kind of, you see a general move towards this kind of more direct involvement. There was kind of a whole re-emphasis on, for example, spreading the Protestant religion, I suppose introducing English as the spoken language, as the written language.
This is happening after 1780, kind of.
Yeah, you see a real kind of drive during that period. And then, of course, the famine then occurs in the 1840s, and that decimated the lower class, not the big farmers. And what's quite interesting, I always think, and people forget this, is that a few years ago, about 10 years ago, correspondence turned up in Boston University, written from a man who lived in Milltown in Kerry. It's back to his son, or to his sons and daughters who were in America during the famine. Quite a remarkable series of letters. Not once was the landlord mentioned in those letters as evicting people or doing anything particularly horrible. The finger of blame was pointed at the big farmers. They were the ones who threw the cottiers on the side of the road, ejected them from the farms, and that whole history of that kind of conflict between the lower classes, I suppose, and the middle farming classes, is something we've kind of forgotten about.
Yeah.
And we've always seen it as kind of this argument between the landlord and his agent at the top and the big farmer in the middle. But there was a whole series of conflicts at the lower level, which people kind of tend to forget about, and a lot of the kind of faction fighting and the local societies, secret societies and things like that, like the White Boys and all these, a lot of it was actually to deal with these local conflicts between those who had property and farms and those who hadn't. So, as I say, there's a whole area of Kerry history, I suppose, and Irish history that we've only kind of started to delve into properly in the last 10, 15 years and move away from this traditional idea of it being a conflict between the landlord and his agent and his tenants. It's a much more nuanced situation.
And would it be fair to say, I mean, this is kind of touching on what's interesting for me is that it seems that this family kind of straddles, especially the first Earl to the third Earl, kind of straddles a change from the feudal system into a more capitalist one.
Yeah,
that happened around 17, and this is happening worldwide as well.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to say that this is some absurdity of Irish life. This is something that's happening worldwide.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start with just the story of Thomas Fitzmaurice, the first Earl. Do you want to try and tell us the story of who Thomas Fitzmaurice was, where he came from?
I mean, he's a fascinating character. I mean,
Yeah.
his historical legacy is very much seen as a tyrant and seen as somebody who terrorized North Kerry. But maybe in some regards he that's something he had to do. I don't know. I mean, you get it's quite interesting if you go through the Crosby papers, you will get glimpses into kind of a softer side of him, I suppose.
Yeah.
He was a man who was born in a very tumultuous period of time. You had the Glorious Revolution, you had the Treaty of Limerick, conflicting loyalties. They were Protestant, but there was strong Catholic tradition there. Himself and his father fled to France when James II was overthrown, but he returned himself very soon afterwards because he obviously didn't want to lose the family estate.
Can I ask a question about that? Just from what I understood about the history of the Fitzmaurices, so we can rewind back. So Thomas's great grandfather, also called Thomas, was a very garrulous rebel against the I won't say is it the English we could say he was a rebel against certainly against the new arrivals that come over from the island of England, and eventually he lost, and he had been like the third generation of people who had rebelled, and then his son Patrick at the age of 9 was taken off him, brought to England and raised as a Protestant, right? Isn't that, am I right in saying this?
Yeah.
So I think that's like important emotional story, that this boy of 9 or 10 was brought to England, taken from his family and raised as a Protestant. And then he returned home as a Protestant, and much of his family around him were Catholic still. And he became Earl of Kerry. And then there was a further outbreak of violence. Would that be the I forget which one it was, and he escaped and went back to England. I had thought, because maybe I'd read is it Vaughan's History of Kerry, that he never came back to Ireland again once he eloped that time.
Yeah, I think that's
he'd
the general
lost his
consensus.
lands, and that he was petitioning all his life in London to get his lands back. And then his son William, the father of the guy that we want to talk about, he also spent all his life in England petitioning for his lands, and that it was only Thomas who got the lands back, the grandson of Patrick who had escaped.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean,
I'm a bit confused by that. Maybe you know more about that.
Well, to be honest, I don't, because I kind of started with the first Earl and I moved forward.
All right, okay.
The 17th century seems to have been a time. I do know this much: the 17th century was, for the Fitzmaurices and for all those kind of families, it was a time when security of land holdings and all that was constantly thrown into flux, mainly because of what was happening in Scotland, England, and Ireland, all the different wars, the different outbreaks, different rebellions. You had the Cromwellian, I suppose, upheaval in the mid-17th century, which caused an awful lot of disruption to rural life, massive famine, depopulation, agriculture and everything, decreased for the best part of 20 years. You have the famous William Petty, the Cromwellian, who came to Kerry, to South Kerry, who did all the stuff around Kinmare. So lands were tainted, lands were constantly put under the control of the courts, but what we tend to forget nowadays is the procedure of taking land off someone and re-granting land to someone and all that sort of thing. The amount of time, the legal jargon, the solicitors, the barristers, I mean, these things would go on and on for years. And, all the members of the family, for example, who would have had a claim on the estate, like wives, mothers, mother-in-laws, daughters, all those things would all have to be taken into consideration. So, and clearly there was a political imperative for them being in London, because unless they were in London and petitioning constantly, and keeping their case in front of the powers that be, then they would have lost their lands, you know.
Okay.
But the fact is that they didn't. And even the fact that they fled to France, which was a treasonous act, but then Thomas came back very quickly. Again, suggests there was a political and economic and social motive there to come back. So whatever his private allegiances were, fundamentally it all came down to, okay, this is my estate, and you know, I will subscribe to whatever king there is once I retain ownership, you know.
Yeah, like they are, like, it's probably as mysterious to people then as it is to us now, when we see like Nama and all these property developers, and they are, you know, it's kind of very oblique and hard to understand, and then I'm sure it was, you know,
it wasn't
on public record exactly how.
There was no emails or anything like that. It was all about who you knew and what influence you had. You know, and I mean that kind of explains his marriage to Anne Petty, because you know, she was the daughter of William Petty, and highly influential character, with a lot of money, of course, it helped. And you can see why he did that. It was a political marriage, to secure him. I suppose secure him as somebody who was looked upon as slightly dubious. And again, you only get glimpses of this. I mean, I struggled to find material on Thomas in terms of his political allegiances and all that sort of thing. I did find something in Trinity College archives about the petition to be secured in his title to his estate, which is kind of back history, which kind of gave me an insight into him going to France and all this. And I often think that there must be more information out there somewhere that could kind of give us a better sense of what happened during the 1690s. You know, and I think probably that experience kind of would explain why he kind of, I suppose, managed Lixnaw and the wider estate with kind of I won't say an iron fist, but certainly he managed it with a sense of, I'm going to put my stamp on this landscape, you know, which of course is what he did.
And why do you think he wanted to put a stamp on the landscape?
I think it was to reassert after a century of, you know, upheaval and a century of losing title and regaining title and uncertainty about title. This was him saying, okay, I am re-establishing the House of Lixnaw as the de facto sovereigns of certainly North Kerry. And so while the whole creation of the house and domain and all that had an economic purpose, there was also a very strong political and social reason to it as well. So, you know, and things haven't changed. I mean, a man today or a woman today is judged by, you know, property and, you know, influence. So what fascinates me always about these characters is you read them, if you read their original letters, which are inevitably written in English, they could have been written last week. I mean, some of them are an extraordinarily modern kind of mindset, which always fascinates me. And again, it always comes down to money, influence, power. You know, so things haven't changed.
And was this an expensive sort of process for him? I always sort of wonder, like, if he lost the land, how would he have afforded all the lawsuits?
How he would have
afforded, like, petitioning over 3 generations.
That, as I say, is something I have never been able to satisfactorily work out. How he managed to persuade the powers that be to, I mean, he basically obviously said, I will support the government and in return confirm me in my title. And I swear allegiance to King William, and off he went. And that's basically, putting it in very blunt terms, is what he would have done. And basically, how would it have worked politically is then he would have used his power in Kerry to basically influence MPs elected in Kerry to vote in favour of the government when they sat in College Green here in Dublin. And that's basically how the whole political system in Ireland worked throughout the 18th century until the Act of Union. So, of course, he would have sat in the Irish House of Lords. And of course, again, along with other lords, would have had strong influence in pushing forward government programs and government bills. So, and in the 18th century, it was all about corruption and bribery. And, that's how, for example, the British government bought out the Irish Parliament in 1800. I mean, it was through bribery. So, I mean, it was endemic. And, the first Earl would have been no different to any one of his peers in using whatever means at his disposal to push his own case. And then if he voted inside of the government, of course, that also helped.
Right.
So
okay. So because of his status, he was able to kind of accumulate, I don't know, favors and help from other people and so and
influence, I guess, isn't it?
Influence,
I thought a good answer thing is it strikes me that there was, as much as there was a kind of communism amongst the courtiers and the ordinary people, there was probably a good bit of communism amongst the elites as well. So when one of them lost his position or lost his status or lost his income, others would have helped him out. Am I
or they would have come in to divide the spoils more often than not.
Because it is like to go to parties and to kind of maintain influence, you can't turn up with rags, you know what I mean? You do need some sort of income. I mean,
I think a part of the interesting thing about the Earls of Kerry is that the fact that they called Lixnaw the court of Lixnaw. I mean, the only other person that calls a court is a king.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
go on, the kingdom.
The Court of St. James is still the official name of the British monarchy. So the fact that he was so audacious as to call his house the Court of Lixnaw kind of gives you an insight into how he perceived himself. I mean, there was other houses in Ireland, of course, called Court as well, but I think it's the only one I know of in Kerry. No, probably somebody pulled me up on this, but yeah, and I mean, again, you get a very strong sense from the surviving documentation that it was a very, very formal household, modelled to a large degree on what you'd call court etiquette. People had to stand in his presence, take off their hats, apparently when they dined, only himself and his wife would sit in chairs with armchairs. The rest of the family would sit on footstools and everybody else would be standing. Often families like this, particularly the Earl, would have a day set aside during the week when he would receive petitions from his tenantry. And you can imagine a poor courtier coming in, quaking in his shoes, presenting a petition to the Lord of all he surveys. And I mean, there's a fascinating, I think it's 1733 list of who was employed at Lixnaw, and it was over 40 or 50 people. And between footmen and postilions and house servants and butlers and housekeepers and gardeners, I mean, it was a huge household. Even they had their own chaplain. I mean, there's nobody else in Kerry had their own chaplain. There's very few in Ireland had their own chaplain. You had to get a special dispensation from the king to have your own chaplain.
Is there any record at all of the, when you were talking about the petitions, let's say, where you could petition the Earl, is there any records of that anywhere, of what kind of petitions the locals
not of the Fitzmaurices themselves, no, but you will get an idea from other estate collections of what petitions would be got.
Like the Godfrey estate, would there have been?
For example, in the terms of the Godfrey estate, a lot of the petitions concerned, funnily enough, the loss of livestock. So, for example, if a farmer, say there was a major flood or a major storm or a very, very bad winter, and the farmer lost 4 or 5 of his prize Kerry cattle, he would petition the landlord for a reduction in the rent equivalent to the value lost. You'd often see then where crops were destroyed, similarly a petition would go in. Another interesting thing is that not a tenants. Again, it kind of gives you this insight into the communal nature of rural Ireland. Yeah. You could get a group of farmers coming together and petitioning the landlord to build a road, so in other words, that they would access markets and fairs and be able to sell their produce much easier. And that kind of is interesting because it meant that the landlord would have to make what was called a presentment to the local assizes, the local kind of courts the kind of forerunner to the county council, for money to build that road. And so you often see things like that. Or, for example, tenants coming together to request investment in embankments or ditches, or, you know, a multitude of different things. And what's also quite interesting, and I'm looking at another estate collection at the moment, which is also Kerry related. These are the Leeson Marshals of between Milltown and Glenavon. Right up until the 1905, local tenant farmers would come to the landlord, not asking his permission that their son could marry or anything like that, but asking his consent that if the son married such a person, that they could divide the farm, or that was the dowry sufficient, or could they secure an interest in the farm. So the fact that that continued right up till the turn of the 20th century is remarkable.
Mm.
And I think if you rewind then 200 years, you know, goodness knows what they were petitioning for, you know. I mean, there is kind of in certain parts of Kerry kind of a tradition where that you had to request the landlord's permission to marry. Now, I have never come across that myself, but other historians have references. So again,
I heard this like anecdote that they were asking people. It's an anecdote from Travelogue, and it talks to the people in Kerry around 1830 in North Kerry, and there's the landlord or the ascendancy have left the area. They're all living in London now, and they use the phrase we need a father around to take care of us. And the traveller was like, why? What the hell? They need a father around to take care of them, and because at that stage, obviously, a different mindset had entered into the world. But at the time, the Lord was seen as like a head of a much bigger family. Is that kind of
very, very true? And I think it's something we again tend to have forgotten about, because again, as I say, going back to the earlier point I made, they always tend to be seen as these oppressive characters. But what is quite interesting as well, and I see this quite a lot in what I've looked at, you will see letters from people, and it's clearly that they're appealing to the Lord to intervene or to do something on their behalf. So there was this kind of paternalistic culture. I mean, it was part and parcel of aristocratic life. It was kind of part of the social compact. In other words, the landlord owns the land, he lets it to the tenant pays the rent, and in return the landlord looks after his tenant's interests. That kind of was the general idea. Now, of course, it didn't always work out like that, as we know, but it is fascinating when you get glimpses into that kind of paternalistic culture that went on, and everything from it, like, and of course we mustn't forget, like, it was the landlords were the millionaires of the 18th and 19th century in rural Ireland. They were the people of influence and power. They are the people who built the roads, built the towns, built the canals, laid out the gardens, employed all these people, albeit on the rents from their tenants. But they were the main drivers of kind of, I suppose, modernization. But in order for them to do that, they needed the cooperation of others. So it was never a question of, I'm going to just do what I like and to hell with you. It never worked like that in reality. You always will see in the documentation compromise or a buyout or, you know, a lengthy court case. And what's fascinating to me is everyone seems to think the law was on the side of the landlord. And yes, it was skewed in his favor, definitely. But if you were a tenant who had means and you were able to apply a good barrister, you could drag on a case for 20, 30 years in the courts. So it is, you know. So, you know, there's a lot more. I suppose the culture of the 18th and early 19th century is a lot more complex than we generally think. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? These people petitioning, because, you know, as theatre makers, we're composing a scene here. Were they like? Was it just the big farmers you told us about earlier who had a
more than likely? Yeah,
it wasn't really the cottiers or the people with 3 chickens.
No. I mean, I suppose you have to ask yourself, why would they? The world of Lixnaw was as far removed from their reality as you could possibly imagine. You know, it would be those who had a vested interest in something, in land essentially, who would have petitioned. You know, and Now, you might have had an occasional thing where a group of, I suppose, poorer farmers who kind of work together as a communal body would, get their parish priest to write a letter to the Lord asking him for permission to cut turf or cut trees or dig such and such a thing. But more often than not, it would be what I call the middling to big farming class that would be the petitioners.
Yeah.
I mean, what's quite interesting about rural Ireland is that we tend to forget this, is the famine didn't wipe out the rich, didn't wipe out the upper middleman or the middling farmers or the big farmers. It wiped out those underneath them. And there's a whole swathe of Irish culture that virtually disappeared in 10 years. And, you get very, very few glimpses into that kind of culture. Well, I've come across, personally speaking, very few glimpses into that culture that existed beneath, I suppose, the farming class. And it's quite clear from collections I've gone through, the landlord rarely had anything or had any direct involvement with the poor, with the exception of if there was an outbreak of cholera or sickness, then you would see, often would see the landlord either building a kind of a rudimentary hospital or providing rudimentary medical care or something like that. But that wasn't particularly because he was interested in saving the lives of the poor. It was more to prevent the contagion from spreading. So it is. So, but again, it varied. So it's hard to generalize.
Can I ask a question? I was reading Marie Edward novel there, and they were talking about what was it called? I think it was called NUI, and it's this classic story where a lord returns from England to take over his estate in Ireland, and his ancestral estate. And through the jigs and the reels, it turns out that one of his cottiers who lives in his land is actually the person who was the heir to the estate, and they were swapped at birth into each other's cots or whatever. Of course, in her novel, it turns out that the cottier is happier being a cottier than he would be to have all the problems of being a lord. But I was interested in the descriptions of where he lived, which I imagine would be accurate because Marie Edgeworth did live in Ireland. And it's like there was a wall on the side of a field, and then to build his cottage, he just got something and leant it against the wall, and then they would sleep underneath that. And it was like, I'm here in a pretty well built cottage, and I'm already worried to see bits of rain coming in and stuff, and there's bits of damp and stuff. So I can imagine these improvised structures seem to me pretty grim places to live, and I wonder how prevalent was that all that people lived in. Was the cottage, the traditional cottage preserve of actually a big farmer, or did a lot of the population live in kind of?
Yeah, virtually none of the housing that the cottiers lived in has survived. Nothing.
Yeah.
What you see in the landscape, if you know what to look for example, I can go around the Godfrey estate and I'll see in every townland there's one particular big house, and you'll always know that was the house either of the middleman or the big farmer who controlled that particular house, and they have survived. A lot of them have survived. And then below that, then you had kind of the big farmer cottage, and most of them are kind of early 19th century, maybe.
Very they're like one or two rooms.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And then underneath that, you have a whole swathe of what the cottiers lived in, and they have disappeared from the landscape. If you look at the first edition Ordnance Survey map, 1830s, and you look at any road in Kerry, you'll see all these little dots indicating there was a residence. If you go and look at that same landscape today, there is no indication whatsoever that anything existed there. Mm-hmm. It's a blank landscape. There's a whole, as I say, the famine decimated that whole layer, I suppose, of rural society. And not only did the people die or starve or immigrate, but their very evidence of their, I suppose, existence in the landscape is gone.
Are there any images at all? Any mock-ups? Any illustrations? Anything at all?
There's a few sketches. I mean, you'll find sketches from writers going back to the late 18th century. You'll find sketches, of course, during the famine of what people lived in, but they were pretty horrific. I mean, there's a wonderful, well, I won't say wonderful, but an insightful description by, I think it was a Welsh minister traveling through Kerry in the 1848, and he mentions people living in a hole dug in the side of a ditch, a whole family. You know, and like,
sorry for laughing now, but yeah.
And how prevalent do you think that was? Let's say for this time of the Lixnaw cottagers.
No. The Lixnaw, Ireland was just recovering from the Cromwellian and then the Glorious Revolution, the Treaty of Limerick, and all that. The population had been pretty much, I won't say decimated, but it has certainly been affected. The population drive, I suppose, of that way the population rose really only happened after the 1780s, particularly after 1790 when war broke out in revolutionary France, and there was a boom in exports. I mean, the farming, there was an agricultural boom, right, for 20 years, and it was all about produce, produce more, and it was during that period that you see the mass subdivision of farms, or the beginning of mass subdivision of farms. Whereas up till then, it wasn't so prevalent, as far as we know, right? You know, the evidence is sketchy. And then you also see then from the 1820s onwards, you see a determined effort by landlords to reverse subdivision. So you start seeing clauses introduced into leases saying they cannot subdivide their land. But saying that in a lease is one thing, and actually effecting it in reality was completely different, because you know, you could have a family, a father living in the main house, 3 or 4 sons, and they all have parts of the farm, a field each. So whereas it might not be written down, and strictly speaking wasn't subdivision, but in reality it was subdivision. And so that's why you see this mass explosion, I suppose, of I suppose that rural poor class from the 1780s onwards. I mean, they were always there, but there was a massive increase. And they're the ones that were living in the side of the road. They were the ones that had the what used to call it, the heifer of one cow or something like that. Again, I mean, there was one townland in the Godfrey estate, Kildare, I looked at in great detail because there was good records for it, and trying to trace who lived there. There was a survey done of the estate in 1841, 42, and then you compare that with Griffith's valuation. And 80% of the people in that townland that were there in 1840 were gone 10 years later. But yet, when you looked at the landlord's rent roll, it was the same farmers. So, as I say, there's a whole class of rural society was wiped out.
What sort of proportion of the population do you think around Lixnaw at the time would have been those small farmers, those cottiers, labourers? What sort of proportion? Is it the vast majority of the people? Or
absolutely, yeah. It is, yeah. Okay. At the time of the Earls, the working, the people who till the soil day to day, would it be? I mean, what is quite interesting is, again, I can only speculate in terms of Lixnaw, but what is interesting if you look at the Crosby stuff, the Crosby estate, which was adjacent to Lixnaw, is that the Lord Brandon had Morris Crosby had, again, similar estate system to Lixnaw. He let his townlands to middlemen, which mostly Protestant, nearly all Protestant, I suspect, middlemen, and they in turn let to kind of biggish farmers. But what's quite interesting is you see some of the middlemen had huge, massive herds of cattle, like 300 or 400 head of cattle, that they would basically farm on that particular, or they would, I suppose, not farm that particular, they would, what's the word I'm looking for? Raise them on that townland. And, you know, it goes back to the thing then, like if he was raising all those herds of cattle on that particular townland, was that entire townland devoted just to cattle raising? Or were there people living on it growing cereal and soil? You know, again, there's a lot there that we don't know, how the land was managed. So
I mean, they could have been I'm just speculating here, but like
Absolutely.
people who were herders who would have been
Absolutely.
employed to move them around.
Mm.
Because 300 in a townland, I mean, you can squeeze them in between your crops, I imagine, if they're managed, if they've got somebody managing the cow.
Yeah, but you can imagine like one person owned 300 head of cattle, which kind of gives you an insight into, of course, fattening bullocks and livestock was the big export business in early 18th century Kerry. Not so much dairy, which only kind of became more prevalent after the turn or the middle of the century. So fattening livestock was kind of the big industry, rural industry. And then growing cereals was a big industry. We seem to forget. Of course, it was probably slightly warmer back then, I don't know. But there was a lot more cereal production in Kerry back then than there would have been in modern times. So,
why do you say it would be warmer back then? Is there any indication that the weather was different?
I think the weather fluctuated over the centuries. So it has, yeah.
And is there an indication that weather was slightly warmer back in the 18th century?
I couldn't be 100% sure about that, but certainly there are records indicating that the weather fluctuated over the last 500 or 600 years. So there's particular cold spells that particularly in Northern Europe decimated whole countries because it was so cold.
But the hot spells perhaps would have been around long enough to fundamentally change what was being grown.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
And of course, we also had a great famine in Ireland in the 1740s, I think.
Yes, we read about that. Yeah.
And which is quite interesting because that some historians claim was more devastating than the 1845 famine, which, as we know, was fairly horrific.
As a proportion of population, I think it was more, but by pure numbers, obviously the 18th.
Yeah, it was less. And again, we have very little insight into what happened to rural society then, because if there was such a shift and change in the 1840s, you can imagine 100 years before that how it must have decimated rural society if it was that extensive. But we have there's very little historical evidence of what exactly happened in Kerry. And like that time, it was because of the weather was the main influence. The weather was so cold it decimated all the crops. So it was so as opposed to the potato. Yeah.
It's I just think it's wild that we have no, like, there's so much life, so much human life that we know nothing about, in that era. And we talk about history like we understand it, like, and we're like, people even say things like, I'm proud of my history or whatever, and you've no idea what it was like for so many people, so many people.
You don't, you see, and it's very easy to generalize it and kind of separate it into the lord and his manor and the middleman and the big farmer and the cottier and all this, but that's a very simplistic view of rural life. How society functioned on a day-to-day basis. How did people marry? How did, how was land divided? What was the role of women? The death rate amongst children was so high. All these things we know, we get glimpses of them, but get no real sense of what went on. Like how, for example, the Irish language was not spoken in Lixnaw. Obviously, it must have been. There's an interesting comment by one of the Earl's agents where he talks about all the Catholics, all the Protestants of Lixnaw parish, because there was no proper Protestant church and no rector, they all had lapsed into popery, Catholicism, in other words. And if they had lapsed into popery, then they also obviously lapsed into the native culture as well. So that's. And the question I'm always asked about is about the Irish language. Did landlords read it, or did they understand it, and did they whatever? And the evidence is sketchy, but what evidence I have seen suggested yes, they had enough fluency to understand. They had to have fluency to understand what was going on, because obviously people were coming to petition them. They weren't coming to petition them in English; it had to be in Irish. So there was either translators involved, translators hired, or they had a basic fluency in the language. And again, I can only speak from the Godfrey and Lisa Marshall papers. You will get the occasional Irish words, which always amuses me, thrown into a letter to describe something that only an Irish word could. And you'll also see, which fascinated me recently, I discovered that amongst the first Irish language school books, the Godfrey children had them in the 1860s and 70s, which throws the whole concept of this complete divide between the big house and the native culture on its head, because clearly they were learning, and these are grammar books, and you can see their handwritings in it and all this sort of thing. So again, every time you think you have something kind of in your head going, oh, this is how it was, something will come up and completely throw it on its head, basically. But as you say, Richard, we know so little about rural life in Ireland. I mean, our sensibility of rural life nowadays is very much based on what we heard from our parents, grandparents, and what they heard from their great-grandparents. It's conditioned by the War of Independence and the Civil War, even stretching back to the Land League of the 1880s. And then if you go back far enough, I remember old people when I was growing up who could remember their grandparents telling them about the famine. But beyond the famine, that's it. You go back as far as there, and that's the rest of it is kind of it's not part of our consciousness. So it's not,
Can I ask a question then? Because just I was reading Owen Rua O'Sullivan, the poet, and he kind of gives some glimpses, because he's alive around this time, 1740s, 50s, 60s, and he's saying, like, because he was notorious playboy, and he was often getting girls into bed and so forth, and but his rebuke was people complained to him. Obviously, it's in Irish, and I can't say exactly, but he said people rebuke me for my interest in women, but he says but when they see a lord do it or a gentry do it, it's totally accepted. And well, I don't know what I'm trying to say with that, but it speaks to kind of an attitude towards sex that seems very different to what a 19th century Ireland or early 20th century Ireland idea of rural life as this repressive.
No. I mean, I suppose our sensibilities towards sex and all that is really a Victorian creation, I suppose, maybe. And also you have to also factor in the re-establishment of the Catholic Church as this very powerful force in Irish society, which it really wasn't up until the 1870s. I mean, it was there, but it hadn't that doctrinal kind of severity about it, if you know what I mean. It was often a compromise between kind of local beliefs and what the church said. So kind of very much how we view matters like that are kind of very much informed by that narrative, which if you step back into this 18th century is not there.
And so could we imagine that there would have been common law, like almost more like how we behave now, like people live together for a while, or maybe for some reason stop or have children with different partners, or like, was there
I mean, look, if you go back to the earlier surviving church records now, I mean, they're mostly Church of Ireland records for Kerry, but they exist from the 80s onwards. You'll see a lot of illegitimates in them. So clearly there was a lot going on in rural society. But it's not an area of history I'm overly familiar with, the whole social world of the.
It's hard to it would be hard.
I mean, I can speak for the aristocracy and the gentry. Yes, I mean there was a certain level of, you marry for wealth, you marry for position, you do not marry for love, and it was very rare to find an aristocratic marriage that was actually faithful or based on love. If it was based on love, often they were ostracized by the rest of the family because, of course, she, and it was always she was blamed, had no money, or she wasn't of the proper status or whatever. So, and of course, the first Earl was a notorious womanizer. I didn't put that into the article, but he was known as having a roving eye. And there's a very amusing anecdote by, I think, Lord Kinmare's aunt, when she heard he had suddenly reappeared at church. I don't know where was that now, was it in Tralee or something? And she said, well, it can't have been for prayers, it must have been because he wanted to oogle some young lass sitting in the audience. And then, of course, when his wife died, he was reputed, and I can't remember what age he was, but he was well advanced. He was going to marry a very young new wife, but he died before he could take that into effect. And of course, the family were horrified. And then, of course, his son, the second Earl, I mean, he went through the whole farce of a fake marriage, and then pretended it didn't happen. Then the courts ruled it did happen, and then she conveniently died. Then he married a woman who the family didn't like. So, and this particular wife, then she was there when the second Earl died, and I think it was 1747 or thereabouts, and she basically abandoned Lixnaw, and that's kind of when the whole decline fell in. And then you had the third Earl, who of course married a woman much, much older than him. And again, it has been suggested to me by some that maybe he's, what's the word for it now? It wasn't so much interested in the females sex he was, but more interested in the male. But again, that's only various rumors about him. So there was a very kind of, what's the word? Louche, I suppose, for want of a better word, kind of attitude to sex and matrimony and all that. And I mean, if you look at the second Earl's will, I think he mentions 4, if not 5, illegitimate children in it, and mistresses. And there's all sorts of scandals associated in local folklore as well with the Earls, which, interestingly enough, passed right down to the 1830s, 40s, whenever, right up to the present century, last century, when these were collected by the Folklore Commission. So
can you tell us some of those folkloric stories?
I mean, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head now, but I remember looking at the time and thinking to myself, now that they're completely far-fetched.
Are they available? How would I find them? Because
I think if you go on, I think they're held by UCD. You can go online and you can search them. You can just search by word. But I do remember coming across some articles, like insinuating that the first Earl might have had an incestuous relationship with one of his daughters and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, that's highly unlikely, But I think they kind of accused him of every possible evil,
Yeah. So. But I mean, it does strike me that this, like, because in the pictures they're like authority and they're all like very serious and all that, but like they probably were just going around like perverts. They're the gang of perverts.
Some of them were and some of them weren't. I mean, appearances were very important to them. So, and the formal portraits that they commissioned, and which portray a certain image that they wanted to convey, and elevated their status, and their costume and the fashion, and even the background indicated their sensibilities, whether they preferred an authoritarian type of government as opposed to kind of a more liberal, all this sort of stuff. You can read lots into their portraits, but behind the scenes, as I say, they got married not for love. They got married because of politics, because of elevation in society, because of family relations, family connections, strengthening power, rarely for love. So once, the Countess of Kerry produced an heir and a spare, that was her job done. And there was kind of a general sense that, well, if the Earl wanted to take his satisfactions elsewhere, then that was just kind of the way it was done. But it only applied to men. Women did not and could not have that luxury, because, of course, if they had a child who wasn't a true blood heir or child, that would be a huge scandal. So whereas men pretty much had wide discretion. The same did not apply to aristocratic women. And like, for example, I mean, what's quite interesting, I only discovered recently, I was looking through something else, I think it was a collection in the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland about the Kilmare family, where one of the Earls of Kilmare was accused of rape, and in London, which I have never before seen in any historical record of this. And basically they bought off the victim. Wow. A group of friends came along and they clubbed together and they basically bought her off so that it wouldn't go to court, and the whole thing was hushed up.
Oh my God.
So that'll give you an indication of how influence and power and money, no more I suppose than today.
That's what I was going to say. It doesn't seem anything different from what happens today.
Well, what's revealed about, let's say, Harvey Weinstein culture, or kind of
Yeah, so, now you will come across characters then, like Anne Petty, the wife of the first Earl, clearly was a pretty formidable woman by all accounts.
Yeah.
And I think was able to manage them to a point and stand on her own 2 feet. And also, I think, if I remember correctly, the marriage settlement was quite clear that she would have had control over her own income, which was a considerable, it was very rare that women would have had that. So maybe there was some inkling, even at the time of their marriage, that the Earl would be troublesome. The first Earl would be a troublesome character. And then, like, you can. It all again depends on the nature of the marriage and the people involved. I mean, I can speak from, for example, the Godfrey collection. The first baronet, Sir William Godfrey, married one of the Blennerhassetts of Ballyseedy in Tralee, and basically he had something like 12, 13 children by her, and she clearly was unwell, maybe from quite early in the marriage, didn't particularly like her husband. He took up with a lady 30 years younger than him, who happened to be a distant cousin, but she was a Catholic, daughter of the local butcher. And he proceeded to have something like 15 children with her. So between the two wives, he had, I don't know, between 25 and 30 children. And you had this interesting parallel where the wife, his official wife, and his children would live in the big house. And then outside the domain gates was his mistress with all his illegitimate children. And eventually he had the first wife, Agnes Blennerhassett. He discovered her in a rather indelicate situation with not the footman now, but one of the stable boys. And basically, yes, of course, it was all her fault. And basically she was locked up in her father's house at Ballyseedy. She was banished from Middletown. Wow. And she died in 1799, and 3 years later he married his mistress. And of course that caused outrage in not only in the family, but in Kerry society. It was not the done thing to do.
Because he legitimized all those children.
No, he didn't. He couldn't retro-legitimize, but he did have some more children with her who were legitimate children. And eventually, his heir, the second baronet, bought them out and told them, "I'll give you money to leave Middletown and leave Ireland and leave Kerry. Just get out of our sight," which is what happened. Wow. And but then you compare that marriage, then the first Sir William and his son Sir John, the Godfrey, the second baronet, he married this woman called Eleanor Cromie from the north. It was a love affair. He met her when he was a tour militia in 1796, and she was this formidable character that basically came to Middletown, stood up to her father-in-law and his mistress and all his illegitimate children, managed the estate in her husband's absence. And her letters survive, a lot of them, and they are a formidable insight into the intellectual world, I suppose, of a late 18th, early 19th century woman in Kerry. You know, her interests, her fascination with helping the poor, helping local women in the village find some kind of a job. You know, she built a school, she established all these charities. So you see, the point I was making earlier, one generation can do one thing, and then the next generation can be the complete opposite. And you know, it's very hard to generalize about these people. But I'm sure the same applied to the Earls of Kerry. That, you know, that, as I say, Anne Petty was a formidable character. Her successor, Gertrude Kerry, the second wife of the second Earl, was apparently quite a weak character. The wife of the third Earl, we don't know very much about her, except that she was much older than him. But for example, if we look at the Crosby family next door, the Earl's daughter was again another very interesting woman. And then, of course, you have the famous lady Arabella Denny, which I presume you've heard about, Richard, the woman who established.
I've heard about it, maybe
yeah.
the lads haven't. She set up the Magdalen laundries.
No,
That's
I know the
right.
name,
Yeah. So you see, again, like, where did that come from? Was it through the influence of their mother? Was it through the influence of seeing their father being this kind of tyrant? Was it a rebellion against it? You know, you get all these kind of fascinating kind of insights into 18th century high society. But unfortunately, because the written record is basically about these people, you don't really get an insight into what happened amongst the lower classes. And I think that's the big empty, I suppose, vacuum in terms of Irish history.
Do you know what I have to think about it? So we're kind of basing our understanding of people's personalities from their letters, you know. But what about when people look back in our era and they look at James Moran's Facebook page, and or anybody's like, and suddenly think, oh, what exciting lives people had back then. They were eating loads of great food and traveling and doing all these great things for charity and speaking out about causes and everything. We would look in one way that probably is our presentation of ourselves. You know, there's a. I don't know.
I think the word you can, and you mentioned earlier, the word you can describe 18th century aristocratic society was the word ennui, boredom.
Yeah.
Particularly for the women at the house, because roles were so kind of, I suppose, delegated.
Yes.
And I mean, you will read descriptions. Well, we had nothing to do with play cards all night or go to a dance or whatever. There was no real job, I suppose, for them to do.
Yeah.
And even the men as well. The fact that they spent so much time in Dublin, and you know, I suppose. And because aristocratic society was so small, there was only like something like 100 houses, great houses in Kerry in the 18th century.
Yeah.
So if you imagine that's 100 families scattered throughout the size of Kerry, it wasn't a lot.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, it's hard to know exactly from their letters, you know, were they living the best lives possible, or was it, you know, much more mundane?
With selfies of their dinners, another great banquet.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd say life was all right being a lord.
I'd say, I mean,
think
clearly,
being an aristocratic lady, sounds
yeah,
different. But
well, I mean, it would seem from the historical record that from the accounts of the first Earl's second son John and a few other records, that kind of the creation of Lixnaw as this wonderful, extraordinary baroque landscape was pretty much driven by the Earl and his wife. It wasn't just him by himself; it was the two of them together. Kind of, well, it's her money and his ambition, and like the fact that he spent so much time, probably from about 1710 onwards to 1730 approximately, laying this out, and the scale of it and the size of it, and even to build a wall all the way around it must have taken 10 years, even with all the labor in the world, and the avenues and the canals and the digging out the canals, straightening rivers. I mean, can you imagine a council, we won't mention a council, getting a contract today to build a canal? They go on for years.
No, and I mean, how exciting. I mean, like, I do a bit of DIY here, and I painted the outside the wall. Like, that was exciting, you know. So much more exciting to build a canal.
And like and build not just one, but build, you know, kind of three of them. You know, and then there was the whole ambition to I mean, the whole purpose of the canals, apart from the aesthetics of it, was of course to drain the landscape and make it fertile. Because of course a lot of that land, like, and when you think I always find it fascinating, considering the expanse of the Earl's acreage, which was over about 100,000 acres, that they didn't pick somewhere else to build this grand edifice. Instead, they picked this seat which had been connected with the family since the 13th or 14th century. Low-lying, swampy ground, regularly flooded, and relatively poor quality. Yet they invested so much money in reclaiming it, in planting of woodland and canals, landscaping it, having all these amazing vistas going off in every direction, building the monument, which was probably the first neoclassical monument built in Ireland. The so-called Hermitage, which is clearly an older, which I now, further to my original article, I now quite clear was kind of an older, maybe 1660s, 1670s house. The so-called Belvedere, or gazebo, the gardens, the fish ponds, the bowling green, it just kind of, I suppose, boggles the mind to think that they did this vast undertaking in a relatively, Kerry was so remote in the 18th century. Can you imagine someone traveling from Dublin and coming into Kerry and crossing the river Feel at Lixnaw and coming down to Lixnaw and suddenly seeing this vista unfold before them after they're traveling through mountains and bogs, everything, to suddenly come across this huge, massive undertaking? I mean, it must have been an extraordinary sight. To see it being created and seeing it being built. And I was fascinated there to see a print, a drawing. It used to be in the Knight of Glyn's collection. I don't know where it is now, but maybe it's in Trinity, by some artist in the late 18th century. He was traveling through North Kerry and he sketched the landscape around Lixnaw, and rising above it all was the monument sitting on the hill. So you can imagine in the early 18th century what a sight that must have been. Surrounded by a landscape where it's full of cottages and temporary housing, to see this vast edifice being built, and it was clearly built by the first Earl, because there's a lot of mistaken records where it was built in the 1690s by the first Earl's father, but it's quite clear from the historical record it was built by the first Earl as his own resting place, and then he changed his mind before he died. He was buried in Kiltoomy graveyard, and only his son, the second Earl, was built there. And
so he changed his mind. I thought the idea was that his request wasn't honoured.
No, that's the other. I was just going to come to that. That's the other interpretation.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So there's two theories there. That he changed his mind at the last minute and wanted to be buried with his ancestors.
Yeah.
Or two, that he was so despised by his son that the son said, "No way, Jose," and sent him off. So,
Can I ask a question? So, obviously he came back to the symbolic place and invested heavily in the symbolic centre capital of Kerry. And we assume, because this was actually, feudalism was ending, and a whole new system was taking place, a more capitalist, globalist system, but capitalist and urban-based world, which we live in now. But did he know that? You know what I mean? Was there any chance that he was coming back to set up his feudal kingdom, and maybe imagine that there might be a more feudal system returning to the world, for all he knew? Further outbreak of war, maybe, or the establishment of was this a guy looking for Kerry independence? Was he looking to set up a separate kingdom? I mean, maybe that's a joke question, but also maybe another, a serious question, is in had he bigger intentions, or what intentions had he?
He had definitely bigger intentions. Definitely, Lixnaw is first and foremost a status symbol. I mean, he's establishing him as de facto.
Oh, sorry, John, we've lost you. Just when we were getting into it. Hello,
can you hear me?
Yes, hi,
you're
John.
back,
We lost you there. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, the internet went down there quick suddenly.
That's grand. Sure. I guess I put that very elaborate question to you, and we can just take your answer from
what was it again? About what was his sense of...
What was his intentions?
Look, I it's hard to say. You can only speculate, but I mean, clearly there was the whole preeminence of his social status, and maybe he was trying to reestablish the Fitzmaurices as the preeminent family in Kerry, because with all that been done in the 6th, 17th century, there was kind of a need to do that. But then again, he was also reflecting the fashion of the time, which was all about improvement, about introducing new agricultural methods, about new means of transport, new styles of architecture, new styles of gardening. So kind of Lixnaw embodies all these different aspects. So like the canals clearly had an economic purpose, the trees had an economic purpose, draining the land, clearly agricultural, probably a lot to do with agricultural improvement. But then the aesthetics of it point to a different sensibility. In other words, they point to, this particularly French and Dutch, I suppose, kind of style of gardening, which means man is controlling the landscape, all these canals, these vistas, these avenues.
Yeah.
So they were coming at it from various different angles, and I mean, there's always an expression, I think, it's attributed to Anne Petty, where she said there's only 2 places in the world worth living in, London and Lixnaw. And, you have that direct connection between the urban metropolitan capital of London and then this outpost in North Kerry, seen as a kind of, I suppose, a beacon of civilization and modernity and things like that. I suppose it's a matter of regret in some senses that it was abandoned in 1750, because it would have been fascinating to see how it would have evolved. But in most other regards, because it was abandoned, means that we can still appreciate, I suppose, the scale of it nowadays, because often these vast landscapes were refashioned in the late 18th century into kind of very naturalistic landscapes, and it's hard to figure them out now. But so, and your question then about, was he introducing a capitalist culture? Capitalism, as we know it, wasn't a concept that they understood.
Yeah,
we understand it, So
yeah. No, actually, I think actually what I think of it is basically I think of him trying to reestablish this kind of enlightened version of feudalism, a kind of an enlightened culture of order and geometry and precision, and but it was kind of folly-some, because actually the tide of history was that culture was actually dying out, and that the free market was this big force that's taking over the world. And in my view, it dictated, the global markets dictated that Ireland, especially rural Ireland, Southwest Ireland, this was just going to be a place that was going to raise cattle or create butter for global markets, mostly in the Caribbean, some in Europe, and that it just wasn't going to be an advanced economy. It wasn't going to be an advanced place. That decision was made in much the way that, maybe extreme example, but like the Congo has been decided to be a place where they mine minerals. And it's like very hard to fight against that, because the global forces of capitalism have decided this, or the Middle East is where they're making oil, or that this is something that maybe you kind of agree is something kind of beyond our awareness even now to do things about it, but certainly beyond the Earl at the time,
Oh,
and
yeah, look, there would have been no way that they would have had that kind of, I suppose, understanding of the world as we would know it.
Yeah.
I will say, though, however, that they were very attuned to, shall we say, I suppose, it was the time, of course, when the British Empire was beginning to expand and the North Atlantic trade was beginning to really grow, and they were very tuned into that. And what's quite interesting is, particularly in the 1730s and 40s, you see this big, huge undertaking by Kerry landowners to connect into Cork. So, new roads were built, new tollways and all this sort of thing. And there was ideas about canals and all this, whatever. And there was a whole move towards like making the transport of produce easier and get it to the market quicker. And then, of course, the British Navy was expanding exponentially. So the butter market became increasingly important. So if you look at Charles Smith's description in 1756, he talks about the new roads that had just been built by the leading landowners of Kerry into Cork. And that was basically that they could get butter from Kerry to Cork as quickly as possible. So they were very tuned in with that North Atlantic market. And of course, the first Earl's ambitions to improve his lands was to increase the stocking capacity. And the stocking capacity, of course, meant that he could then export his cattle to wherever the market was. So that was as far, I suppose, as you could say that they were tuned into the wider economic situation. You know, but
you know,
look,
like
I mean,
to create a place that there was going to be fashionable parties, or where, you know, people are wearing good clothes.
that was,
or,
yeah,
like
that's
just
moving.
That is moving into the centers of Paris.
Yeah,
London,
it is. I
Dublin,
think,
and
yeah, I think you're right there. It was a vain glory to kind of go thinking that they would establish the Court of Lixnaw as this kind of alternative capital of Kerry. You know, fashionable society would gather there, and it was this, that, and everything else. I mean, the fact that their own chapel, which was painted with frescoes, the fact that these, you know, rooms decorated with the most beautiful fabrics and furniture and inlaid silver and panels and all this sort of thing. What was it for? Because, as I said, landed society in Kerry was about 100 houses, 100 families. You know, and if we look at how quickly Lixnaw deteriorated after the death of the second Earl, there was no longevity to it. Like, it was forgotten about. You know, and
whereas that was built somewhere closer to London, for instance, or just outside Dublin, it probably would have survived and been maintained. And
yeah, and I mean, even if you look at Kerry itself, like, look at the two great domains that have survived, Muckross House being one of them and Killarney House being the other. And the reason being, of course, is because those particular families had a different thing going on there. They recognized very quickly that Killarney, the lakes, were a very aesthetic draw for tourists. And so they invested heavily in, I suppose, beautifying the landscape.
Yeah.
And it's interesting if we think about how we interpret Killarney today as beautiful mountains and the woods and all this. What you effectively are looking at is a domain landscape that was created by two of the leading Anglo-Irish families in 18th to 19th century Kerry. Now, of course, they had this wonderful landscape to work with. But can you imagine if that land hadn't been part of a great domain, it would be split up, covered in housing, and probably all the woods cut down. But the fact it was protected and maintained and beautified by these families over the course of 2 centuries means we've inherited this great asset, you know, and like, they were smart, you know, and they used Killarney to their advantage. Didn't save them, of course, in the end, but, you know, we still have Muckross today in Killarney Park, the national park, effectively. You know, so if we compare them, say, to the Earl's attempts in Lixnaw, you can see which succeeded, which didn't. Also, if you look at the Dennies of Tralee, I mean, the castle was in Tralee in the, what's it called, Denny Street, and Tralee was very much a focus of their power, and of course it was an established centre of power, and they managed to hold on long after the Fitzmaurices had departed the scene. And again, if you look at Killarney Town Park, everyone seems to forget that that is the domain of Tralee Castle. That again is another great domain landscape that would have been familiar to Arabella Denny, who of course was the daughter of the first Earl. So you see, we still have these assets, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, that were created by these families that we enjoy today without recognizing where they came from. It's thanks to these people that we have them. So it's an interesting twist of history, you know?
Yeah. But what about all the money they stole off the common people?
Yeah, it's you know, market capitalism at its very best, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, but did they steal it? You know,
no.
It depends on your viewpoint.
It's I suppose in the Marxist sense that they accumulated their wealth from ordinary people's labor. Yeah. But let's not we don't have to deep dive into that. But
yeah, as I always say, you know, to that, you know, and I suppose, very conscious of when you're going through rentals and ledgers, and you see people coming in and they're struggling to pay, and they're trying to pay with a cow, and they're trying to pay with a few bags of flour, and they're having not enough money. And you kind of feel it, oh God, like it was such, and it was, there's no point getting away from it. It was a completely unequitable, largely indefensible, particularly after the famine system. But it was pretty much the system that applied across Europe. Every country in Europe had a similar regime. Some of them have lasted a lot longer than they have in Ireland, like in Spain and Italy. The biggest states survived way longer. And you could argue that every great palace, every Windsor Castle, Versailles, you know, the Royal Palace in Madrid, all these great art collections, you go to the Vatican and you see the wonders of the Vatican, they were all built on the backs of the, I suppose, the poor and the underprivileged. So it is what it is. That's what I'm trying to say. You know, and I mean, you could say Mucker's House, this is the premier tourist attraction in Kerry. It was built by money that would have got it from rents from people around Killarney. You know, those landscapes, those trees would have been planted with funds that would have been derived from the rental. So you see, it's like, what stage do you say, okay, this is completely wrong, or do you say, okay, that's just the way it was? I mean, look, that there are questions that are beyond my.
they're kind of separate. They're separate arguments, I guess. And you know, ethics is quite a difficult, complex topic. Always.
It is, yeah, and especially in an Irish context, because you're dealing with that kind of colonial aspect.
Yeah.
You know, would a native aristocracy have been any different? I doubt it, because they were all influenced by.
I mean, they were a native. This is the thing with the Fitzmaurices; they were a native aristocracy.
Yeah.
So,
and like it's quite interesting. I mean, I was reading the diaries recently of a landlord who lived between Kerry landlord who lived between 18. His diary survived between 1880 and 1939. Right, so he lived right through the whole War of Independence and Civil War and all that. And he, in one level, was what you'd call the ultimate English gentleman. Went to college in England, went to university in England, practiced at the bar in London for many years. But he would fascinate you, and he'd suddenly say he was traveling back from London to Kerry, and he'd say, "Oh, I was on the train and I met two fellow Kerrymen were there." Now, the fellow Kerrymen could be Lord Kenmare and Mr. Herbert of Muckross. Or he'll be at something in London and he'll say, there was a fellow Kerryman at this function. Or, there was more Irish here. And of course, he was talking about his own particular class. That they never used the word Anglo-Irish. That whole concept wasn't part of their understanding of themselves. That label has been applied to them. And it's always fascinated me how he had a very strong sense of who he was and his place in society, in rural society in Ireland, you know. But
can I ask on that topic, like from what I can deduce from for Maria Edgeworth's, is that even the aristocracy in Ireland spoke with a brogue, with an Irish brogue, and perhaps this Kerry man that went to, like, he would have spoken with some sort of Irish brogue, maybe an upper class Irish brogue, but at the same time, nonetheless.
Yeah, again, it all depended on their level of education, where they were brought up, their exposure to Irish society. I mean, all these families, like, and I mean, I can only really, I suppose, speak for the ones that I know of. Like, their staff, their upper servants were nearly normal, or usually, if they were Church of Ireland, they would have been Church of Ireland or Protestant staff. But once you get below the level of housekeeper and butler, a lot of the staff were local people who would have spoken Irish, or spoken English with an Irish brogue. So, of course, they were going to be, you know, and I mean, often the reason that they were sent away to be educated in England was to get rid of the brogue, you know. Not only simply to advance their prospects in the world, but just to kind of, I suppose, polish them off. But some of the families couldn't afford to do that, so they were educated in Ireland. So, you know, they always
in that parliament, let's say Grattan's parliament in the 1780s, like, speakers would have spoken with an Irish accent, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there this whole thing that Parliament had a whole different way of speaking than the British Parliament did, and
Yeah, I'm sure if you were a rural landlord brought up in the wilds of Roscommon or Kerry or wherever, with very little exposure to say public education system like public school and all that, of course you would have spoken with an accent, you know.
yeah,
You know, and I think it touches on the subject I mentioned earlier about the Irish language. I mean, there's no direct evidence, but there is circumstantial evidence that many of them would have understood Irish. And I say what I always find fascinating, particularly in the Godfrey letters, is they will drop in an Irish term for something like the word boreen or, you know, balance or these kind of expressions, everyday words, into a letter or a way of describing the weather, or even the way they write English. Sometimes you're going, that's a very Irish sounding way of writing English. And clearly that is something that was part of their culture, you know. And then the whole tradition as well of the big house of, you know, I can't speak for the Earls of Fitzmaurice or the Earls of Kerry, but I can speak for the Godfreys of Milltown. For example, at the funerals, they used to employ queeners, these women who used to cry, professional criers, right up through the 19th century until one of the Godfrey wives said she didn't want this hullabaloo at any more funeral. You know, they always also, there's written descriptions of festivities in the big house where all the music would be local musicians, fiddlers and harpists and all these people called to play music. So there was a lot more kind of a crossover than we give them credit for. You know, it's very hard to put yourself into that position, you know, or imagine that world that they lived in. You know, but what clues we do get would suggest that, you know, that we have this idea of them living in the big house, completely isolated, cut off, big walls. That's not how it operated in reality. It couldn't operate like that. It could not operate. A big house could not operate by itself in the landscape, self-sufficiently alone. Just impossible.
Yeah.
So they had to be. I often think of them as this kind of space where there was kind of a crossover between cultures. And I think that's often the reason why we find it so hard sometimes nowadays to kind of not deal with them, but maybe, what's the word? Come to terms with them.
Yeah.
You know, that they are kind of this kind of crossover spaces. So, for example, like we could have a domain which to look at it purely from aesthetic points of view would be nothing dissimilar to what you'd see maybe in England. But then when you're asked the field names, you could be said, oh, well, that's Park Dove and that's Park Moor. That's, you know, called something else in Irish.
Yeah.
So you've this area where it's kind of almost like a clash of cultures, or where there's cultures overlaying each other's, which I find particularly fascinating. You know, these shared spaces, and it's the same applies to our towns and villages. I mean, like Killarney is very much the creation of Lord Kinmare. Tralee is very much the creation of the Denny family. Milltown, modern Milltown, was almost entirely the creation of the Godfreys. Yet no one is insinuating for 1 minute that they're not Irish. But yet the aesthetics and the economic and social reasons they were created reflected on the families who built them. So, as I say, there's a lot of things in Ireland which I suppose we don't maybe understand where they came from or what they mean, or, you know, they're interpreted differently now.
Yeah.
So,
well, look, this is our project. This is what we're taking on, is to try to.
So could you explain to me now? I've done all the talking now. Could you tell me what's I suppose your plan is, or what's?
Well, our plan at the moment is frankly to put together a play, and an important part of that for like any theatre makers is research and learning about our topic and understanding it as best we can. And at the moment, we're actively doing that. We're trying to read, and we're trying to speak to people like yourself, John, and we're just trying to get a kind of a sense of what life was like at this time, and also to kind of see what room there is for our own imagination and our own kind of you know, speculation, which I think we are able to do, and not to speculate in a stupid way, but we're trying to be able to speculate in a in a possible way. What's the right word there? In a speculative,
Realistic.
in a realistic way. Yeah.
Well, I suppose one
Legitimate
of the,
way. In a
yeah.
legitimate way. Yeah.
Well, I
And-
suppose the story of Fitzmaurice does give you a space to kind of, I suppose, create a kind of I won't say create a world, but it allows the room for imagination because the records are scant enough, and because you have to kind of, infer a lot of the things and kind of assume a lot of things and, try and figure out what their motives were. It does allow the mind to go, wow, what was the reasoning behind this? And, like the imagination behind it, or the the raison d'etre behind it, like it definitely lends itself to a kind of a Game of Thrones plot. I always think, because there's so much that went on there, and I often think, the community in Lixnaw and North Kerry in particular, they're missing a kind of an opportunity here now, and your play might actually help reverse that. They have their own real life kind of saga, dynastic saga that went on there, with intrigue and infighting and backbiting and conquest and confiscation and all sorts. And I know there's a new book coming out on the family shortly.
Is that Kay Cable? Is she?
Yeah.
Is that being printed now, or is she?
It is, and
fantastic.
Kay would also be worth, if you haven't spoken to her already.
We're going to get onto her now and definitely see if she.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
because she really was into the gossip, right? She's into the kind of the
I think, and she probably would give you a very good insight into the culture, the kind of aristocratic culture that the Earls lived in. So, and then, like, of course, you'll also get other people then who give you a different kind of local interpretation of what the Fitzmaurices were and what Lixnaw means. And are you basing the play in the period of the first and second era, or is it kind of later?
Yeah, I think it's a great time to take a start off point. I feel it's always either, let's say, 1748 or 1776. I'm kind of altered between those dates. So 1748, let's say, is when the castle is still there and are operating and very much alive, and then 1776 it's already gone into disrepair, and it's a good time internationally because, like, that's when United States is
that's right, of course you have that connection there too, with
there's
the US.
Connection there,
and
so we are looking and we're trying to really imagine how that transition takes place, and what that might have meant for people, which in many ways I would venture was not great. Like the family leaving the area and the court disestablishing itself was part of a nexus of events that, like, didn't help rural life in Ireland.
No, it didn't. And I mean, there's a comment, I think, by Thomas Fitzmaurice. He was one of the knights of Kerry. I think he was the 18th knight of Kerry, sometime around 1820 or thereabouts, 1814 maybe, where he says that the single biggest curse of rural life in Ireland was the absentee landlord. Because he said landlords in residence were there to deal with, because they were like the social welfare, they were like the employment, they were like their county council all rolled into one. And, if we had an absentee landlord, often you had an agent who was only interested in the money. And whereas a resident landlord, if they were of a kind of a decent enough character, they took a genuine interest in the community and in improving things and in, investing money there and employing people and all this. And so when one of their own class said that, one of the biggest ills of Kerry was the fact that so much of it was governed or ruled by absentee landlords, that gives you a pretty good idea of, both, number one, the importance of a resident landlord, but number two, how widespread absenteeism was. So I think that the fact that Lixnaw was effectively dismantled from 1750 onwards was a major economic blow to North Kerry. Aside from the fact that the number of people he employed, and the economic contribution of the household, but also, I suppose, the status of Lixnaw itself. It kind of just basically, effectively disappeared off the map. So, whereas I think the man who bought a lot of the estate, what's his name here, the Earl of
Richard
Listowel.
Hare, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's focused very much on Listowel and developing Listowel,
Yeah.
and he had no interest in Lixnaw. So it's an interesting ongoing debate.
Yeah, and also like when people like those capitalists kind of came in, they ran things like on a very strict profit basis. So if somebody comes in and says, I lost 3 cows, they're like, tough. I've got another fella, he'll pay me the rent, so you just do it or don't, you know. And this is not so good for ordinary people's lives. I would venture. But listen, sure, we've loads to talk about. But we'd love to talk to you again, maybe if that was possible. Really deep dive the next time.
So what's your plan with these series of podcasts? Are you going to put them up online?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're going to put them online in the various formats. James here, the silent James Moran on the bottom left. He's a regular podcaster, so he'll kind of help us out. But there's like I like doing this as a visual thing. I'm going to put photos on top, present it on YouTube, I guess. But then I think the sound quality is pretty good, so we're going to just release it as a sound version as well. I think it's
okay.
So people don't have to
sufficiently edited, I hope.
I don't think so. I think we're going to put the whole thing up. We might take out the brief, if that's all right. If that's all right with yourself.
Well, I presume the bits at the start.
A little bit at the start.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, it's. I can provide you with visuals of this, and I mean, I'm giving the talk online, on Zoom, I think.
Okay.
I think it's on the 18th of October, on behalf of Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society.
Yeah.
On Lixnaw, it's representing the presentation I made, which I don't know, were you there, Richard?
I was,
2 years ago.
I was there.
Yeah. So
fantastic.
it's the same.
It was a great, very exciting presentation.
Yeah. So
well, I hope you don't mind we might. This won't steal the thunder. This is only going to get people, give them a taster for your talk.
Yeah. Well. How soon will it go up, or what's the?
Well, it'd be great to do it maybe in the next week.
Yeah.
If that's.
And have you many writers lined up, or many people lined up?
Not nailed down, but we're hoping to get people lined up maybe at least once a week from now, for the next few weeks at least.
And have you got an insight for when the play will be finished?
We're going to do a work in progress outdoor performance sometime in late October, maybe November. Right. And so we'll work out how to do, I guess, canopies and things like that. And so this is something we haven't done before, but with the new COVID, as theatre makers, we're going to try and do and learn how to do outdoor performance, probably using speakers and microphones and things. But I mean, it'd be fantastic to do it in the grounds where the
wow, that would be amazing.
Where Lixnaw Court was, you know.
Yeah, God.
Because you've got all those amazing views and the canals as a background and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I'm still not quite sure who owns the rooms at the court, but I mean, I think there was some way they could. I don't know, not develop it, because you couldn't restore something like that, but conserve it as a space, and like what an amazing space it would be for like plays or events or things like that. And
just even for the community to return to.
Yeah. And were you performing yourself or NEV in the play? No.
Shane's the main actor.
Oh, so you were the first Earl, or second Earl.
He hasn't been cast yet. Like he might be a servant. He might be playing a servant. I don't know.
I might have to address you as my lord. So next time I'm on.
Exactly. Tip your hat.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Interesting. So is that enough to keep you going for the moment?
I think it's great. It's a fantastic conversation to have, and
Yeah, thanks a million, John.
Stay
Thanks for your
tuned.
time. That was really, really interesting. There's so much there. Every time you talk about something else, it opens up a whole other chapter and stuff to ask questions about. It's fantastic. It really is.
It's
But it's almost reminds me of the Bill Bryson novel, like A Short History of Everything. My overriding impression when I read that book is like, wow, we know a lot and we know nothing.
no.
We just know nothing at all. There's a lot to know, but we know such a small sliver of what was going on.
And that's history. You'll only get, you'll only get insights to elements of it, and they're very much based on your own interests and on your own prejudices and on your own interpretation of material.
Absolutely,
and and like there's whole sections of it that there's whole sections about the history of Lixnaw in particular that I haven't gone near. I don't know, has anybody else gone near? But like we've touched on some of them today. But as I say, you can only get snippets. But from snippets, it's amazing what you can create.
Yes, exactly. But then that gives us leeway as well. That actually gives us a lot of leeway to fill in the gaps ourselves. In a way, it helps, and in a way, it hinders.
Yeah. Absolutely, it allows the imagination to fill in the blanks.
Exactly. Yeah. There were dragons back then, weren't there? Yeah. That's all right. Yeah, Grant.
Wouldn't be surprised. We know what the first Earl had in the backyard.
Oh my God.
But okay, so I'll leave it there. So listen, I'll talk to you again sometime. I'm looking forward to seeing this.
Excellent. Thanks a million, John. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
And there we go.